Good afternoon, everyone. Final few parts of the afternoon. For those of you who haven't joined us, welcome. My name's Ben. I run the incident response side of Crest from a sort of assessor and focus group sort of thread, but my day job is running a cybersecurity company called Freebie Data Security. Here with to hand you over to Dan, who's going to talk to you about negotiations with threat actors. So welcome, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. As introduced, I'm Dan Saunders. I lead the incident response team at Kivu Consulting. As kind of mentioned, we're going to focus a bit today on threat actor negotiations, or cyber extortion, as it's also referred to. It's an element of kind of cybersecurity that some people may have encountered. Some people may not have encountered it before. A lot of the times we're dealing with C-suite executives that have found themselves in a position of a cyber extortion event for the first time ever, and we're essentially there to help them, guide them through that crisis. So this is just a stat from last year for you from our visibility at Kivu. So at Kivu we do both forensic investigations, etc., but we also run the threat actor or attack team, which essentially engages adversaries in trying to obtain actionable intelligence, and also in the case that an organisation decides that it's in their best interest to pay a ransom, then we'll walk them through that process around the sanctions. We'll also do the sanctions checks, facilitation of payment, if that is the case as well. But last year, we dealt with 45 specific unique strains of ransomware across hundreds of incidents. So it's quite a big figure. Generally, what we're seeing at the moment is there's an awful lot of leaked source code out there. So the kind of initial access kind of gateway for these ransomware groups is significantly reduced. So essentially, you do not need multiple different developers to go and develop whole new big game ransomware strains when source code is already out there. You can go and leverage that, make it your own. Often we find new strains of ransomware which have got traces of source code from other ransomware strains which are just being reused to save a lot of the effort. And this is one reason why we're seeing a lot of new ransomware groups pop up. That, and also rebranding, which we can talk about more shortly. So just before we jump into the negotiation side of things, I'm sure many of us who have worked in incident response will be familiar with this typical kind of adversarial unauthorized intrusion lifecycle. So typically, adversaries gain access. A lot of the time we're seeing at the moment it's SEO poisoning or unpatched vulnerabilities. The compromise carry out privilege escalation, identify what the crown jewels are in the organization, which a lot of the time is data stored on file servers. They'll then attempt to try and identify where the backups are stored and remove them to prevent simple restoration. One thing we've seen a lot of over the last couple of years is specific targeting of hypervisor environments. So ESXi infrastructure, or Hyper-V as well, but they're specifically creating ransomware strains to target ESXis, because in that case you don't need to go and encrypt hundreds of systems and gain access to those. You can just go and target the back end, which is hosting those virtual disk images, and encrypt them. And this is the stage really that it's essentially what we call game over. Because data's been encrypted, data's been exfiltrated, and at that point we need to start thinking about the incident response work streams, which does include threat actor negotiation. So when we talk about cyber extortion, this is just a kind of high-level type framework we created for this talk, but this is what we typically see and things that we need to consider when it comes to threat actor negotiation. So typically there can be multiple layers of extortion. It could just be that they've encrypted data. They may have, in parallel to that, exfiltrated data. We've had cases where adversaries have launched DDoS attacks in parallel to that as well. Notification side of things, various different forms of notification, from email through to the common types such as ransom notes on systems, which is normally a telltale sign that an organization's been hit. What we're seeing in terms of communication protocols, how we reach out to adversaries, a lot of the time they're standing up their own chat servers on the Tor network. But we are seeing increased levels of contact via Tox chat as well. And generally, payment methods for threat actors, they will typically accept various different types of cryptocurrency. We tend to focus on Bitcoin more around the compliance side of things, which we'll talk about more shortly. What we're seeing a lot of is various different innovative pressurizing tactics. We worked on the case a few days ago where the adversaries were actually printing off the ransom notes as part of the attack to spread the word. But we're seeing increased numbers at the moment of telephone calls to various different stakeholders and employees throughout the organisation. So if you're trying to keep a lid potentially on an incident that's occurred, you don't want the name out there, you don't want the press getting involved, and that can be quite difficult to handle. So really engaging an adversary is one tool you could potentially leverage to try and stem that pressure. Now, if we look at this specific framework, and what I've done here is mapped it to a specific threat group called Akira, which are a ransomware as a service model where they have multiple different affiliates that are launching attacks and deploying the ransomware strain. This is specifically their framework which they tend to leverage. So prior to any sort of ransomware attack, they'll exfiltrate data, they'll leave ransom notes on the systems, and they'll entice you to engage with them via their chat portals. Akira typically accept payment for ransoms in Bitcoin, and their pressurizing tactic really is they do it over a couple of different stages. Often if they see that you aren't engaging and you're not willing to potentially pay, they'll release your name on their site and a bit of an overview, and then later on they'll look to publish data. We've dealt with a number of incidents with Akira. We've actually still got a couple of clients now that got hit around August time last year where their names have appeared on the site but their data is yet to be leaked. So that's an interesting thing. And one of the conclusions we've come to, based on at least our exposure to Akira, but also open source reporting as well, is they're absolutely inundated with victims that they're dealing with. So a bit more about the legalities around this then. So generally, one thing we get asked all the time by an executive when we're running these types of engagements, often we're running forensic engagements and then they've decided actually we potentially want to engage a threat actor here. And one of the first things we're asked is it legal to pay a ransom? Now, this is one of those questions where it depends. The bottom line really is, the reality is organizations do pay ransoms. The majority of those that do pay them have gone through relevant sanctions checks. So we need to make sure that we're not potentially paying a sanctioned entity, because that can have repercussions, not just on our organization that's facilitating the process, but also the victim as well. And often when we conduct these engagements, we've already got we're already communicating to the cyber insurer if there's a cyber insurance policy in place. There's also a breach coach that's engaged as well, which is typically a reputable law firm that is leading the organization through the incident, and also experts that have dealt with these specific threat actors before as well. So how do we do sanctions checks? So generally, this depends on the investigation solely, and typically what we tend to do is we'll gather as much information as possible about the intrusion. So you need to have the forensic work stream very much engaged and conducting the investigation, identifying what the root cause was, what the attack vector, a comprehensive timeline of exactly what's taken place during the intrusion, and obviously all the information that's collated from that, such as the TTPs, or tactics, techniques, procedures, and also indicators of compromise, IOC, is then fed into the sanctions due diligence analysis. We also leverage information from the threat actor communication that we do as well, because we've got a pretty good understanding of multiple different adversaries and affiliates that are employed by the ransomware groups, because some of them do have certain tradecraft which we've observed around the communication as well. So we take all of that information and we conduct what we call due diligence analysis on that. So we'll look at our own intelligence that we hold on these different adversaries. We'll look at open source intelligence as well. And we also have other channels of intel which we can refer to conduct this analysis. And what we're essentially looking for is any indication that potentially any of the IOCs that we have, any of the TTPs we've observed which might be unique to a specific adversary, or any other information we have could indicate, based on a weighted balance, whether or not we can attribute this to a particular sanctioned entity. The last sanctioned entity, at least on our cases that we had, was actually last week, which was an Iranian APT called Muddy Water, which had employed ransomware to target an organization. The organization very much is wanting to pay because they didn't have sufficient backups. But following the forensic investigation we conducted and the analysis that we've done in parallel with the threat actor negotiations, we were able to attribute it to a sanctioned entity, which means we can't pay them. But ultimately, that's quite a big warning sign, because there are sanctioned entities which are leveraging ransomware for their nefarious processes. So just some statistics for you, again, from last year, but also Q1 and Q2 this year, and this is specifically from our own incident response engagements across hundreds of engagements where we've done negotiation, payments, etc. So one of the largest ransomware demands we saw specifically was last year, $150 million US, believe it or not. You can probably tell the size of the entity that we're potentially dealing with there. That was actually specifically related to the Move It campaign, where we obviously saw a zero-day vulnerability which hit multiple organizations. Goes without saying the organization actually didn't even want to engage the threat actor really, and they obviously didn't pay $150 million. Typically, the ransom demands are based on two different things. One, before any ransomware attack, adversaries are very strategic. They will look for cyber insurance policy documentation, which you store on your file servers a lot of the time. They'll look at your financial documentation. What they'll also do is leverage open source information such as Zoom info, etc., and they'll look at the perceived revenue for the organization. And generally, they tend to base the ransom demand around 1% to 3% of that. But ultimately, it depends on what they perceive to be the value of potentially the data that they hold. A lot of organizations, and we'll talk about this more shortly, it's not always the case that they're just paying because they need to be able to decrypt data. It's potentially what is the other leverage that the threat actor has, such as the data that's been exfiltrated. So far this year, you can kind of see the numbers are a bit more kind of high in terms of the payments and average demands. But this is specifically the figures that we've seen across 2023 and 2024, obviously in US dollars. So to pay or not to pay then, ultimately, we never go into an engagement and say to a client, you need to go and pay a ransom. We will never tell a business they should or shouldn't. All we are doing is providing them as much information as possible to enable them to make an informed decision of what they feel is best for their own organization. The reality is many organizations do pay. There are some organizations out there which will decide not to pay. There's some organizations which have policies that say they don't pay, and you'll see how quickly they go out the window when they become a victim of a ransomware attack. A lot of the incidents we deal with, and I've spoken all about ransomware, but it's not just ransomware. We've often been engaged in matters where an organization suffered a DDoS attack, which is constantly hitting their website and taking down their services, and they've not been able to mitigate that. Other occasions, we're often engaged on cloud-type incidents where maybe databases or S3 buckets have been exposed in AWS, or there's been certain big third-party breaches. So your organization may store data with a third-party cloud service provider. We've seen a few instances of that in the news at the moment. And as a result of a breach of that, it could be that the organization that actually holds that data has been extorted. So typically, these are the specific factors that we tend to go through with C-suite, et cetera, during these types of incidents and the considerations that they need to make. Appreciate the text is a bit small. We've spoken a bit about the sanction entity side of things. Ultimately, if we have attributed this to a sanction entity, we won't be paying them. Most organizations will consider the business impact and the time and cost of recovery strategies. So generally, if you are to pay a ransom and you get a decryptor, just because you get the decryptor doesn't mean you're back up and running tomorrow. There can be a number of difficulties and issues around that. We've often seen organizations work out the time that they perceive it will take to recover the IT systems and compare the cost of that and the time to the actual ransom demand itself as well. So for example, we had an organization that said, every day we're down, it's costing us $500,000 US. So we'll compare that to the ransom demand and how long we think it will take to be back up and running if we get a decryptor, etc. The ransom demands, generally, the modus operandi of these threat actors, ultimately they have one objective, which is financial gain. The only caveat to that is if the adversary has got other nefarious objectives. What I mean by that is there are some threat actors out there which will deploy ransomware, but they are not actually a ransomware group. It could have been nation state that actually had a different objective, and potentially they've been caught out along the way, so they've deployed ransomware along that process to cloud what their real objective was. But the ransom demands are generally set by these adversaries. They are flexible. If you do work with them and negotiate with them, then you can get those ransom demands down. And last year we got around, on average across all the threat actors that we negotiated with, it was around 48% average discount. But it really depends on a case-by-case basis what the perceived valuation is of that data and really to understand if they have an upper hand or not. Threat actor reputation is important. So there was a talk actually earlier in another stream which I attended, which was talking about junk gun ransomware. So we deal with everything from the well-known ransomware groups, Lockbit, et cetera, all the way through to adversaries which have used junk gun type ransomware. Organizations will consider this as a factor because most big game ransomware groups care about their reputation. So they will commit to terms and conditions as part of deals. And what I mean by terms and conditions, often they will disclose how they got in. Sometimes they'll give you a nice little funky report which says go and enable MFA as well. But they will also disclose certain other information and commit to certain agreements, such as we're not going to attack you again. Obviously, they can go and rebrand, or affiliates do work for different ransomware groups. We're not going to re-extort you, and there's various other agreements which you can put in place as well. But the bottom line is they do care about their reputation. So if a big group decided to default on any of those terms and conditions, ultimately we work with a lot of major law firms and cyber insurance panels, word would get out, and we'd also use that information and inform other victims that we work with that, hey, we've had some issues with this threat actor, it's something that we need to consider. Brand risk, contractual obligations, pretty self-explanatory. If data has been exfiltrated, are there any potential contractual obligations which could be compromised as a result if that data was to get leaked out there or published by threat actors? Generally, there isn't really a market for selling exfiltrated data from ransomware attacks unless we're talking about the sort of data that could have implications on potentially like national security, et cetera, which we have seen, and we've dealt with incidents around that, where organizations have decided we want to pay purely because of that specific aspect. Finally, a multi-layered extortion. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not always a case that it's just ransomware and data exfiltration. We've seen accounts that have been taken over, and we've seen DDoS attacks as well. We do continually see new innovative ways in which they're employing to apply additional pressure on these types of attacks as well. So what are the key objectives that we tend to set out on any of these engagements? These are the 3 points that I always discuss with our clients. The first, which is the buy time. So just because you're engaging a threat actor doesn't mean you're going to pay them. A lot of the time we engage them to buy time for our clients. That could be to relieve some of the pressure from telephone calls that they're receiving from these adversaries or various other aspects around that. But really buying time enables you to execute the IT recovery strategy. But in addition to that, it's not just a technical element, it's also so you can stand up crisis communication. Can you get your PR in order? Reality is, if you're not going to pay and your name does get out there, you're going to be absolutely inundated with the media, etc. So can we get more executive type tasks aligned? Obtaining actionable intelligence. So as I mentioned earlier, threat actors will disclose certain information to you. It's kind of a bit of a psychological war game, let's say. Often we've had threat actors that will disclose the root cause, how they got into the environment. Obviously we take it with a pinch of salt because we're dealing with cyber criminals, but we can go and leverage that information, correlate that to our forensic investigation and see actually, is this plausible? Is it potentially a real attack vector? Often they will disclose proof of life or file list of data that they've taken. We had one matter where a client had said to us, actually, quite a big name, we don't want to pay any ransoms, we want you to engage to buy time and also get actionable intelligence. But interestingly, this victim was being extorted by 2 different groups. One pretty reputable ransomware group and one data breach group. And this was a bit confusing initially, but what it turned out to be, long story short, was an affiliate that was working for both groups, and they'd given them both a set of data and were then trying to extort the victim twice. So 2 for the price of 1, a bit difficult to deal with. However, what we were actually asked to do, which was quite unique, was to leverage the negotiations, get as much information out of them as possible, and play both actors off each other. And in that specific case, we were able to get one adversary to flip on the other and provide us a lot of insightful information, which was quite beneficial for us. And we classed that as a success, not because potentially data was leaked. However, we were able to get a lot of information, which the client was quite happy with, as were the authorities. And finally, negotiating ransom amounts down. So I spoke a bit about that earlier. Ultimately, if you are seen to be engaging a threat actor, they will give you more time. They will reduce some of that pressure. and there is always room for negotiation. A lot of the time you do need to justify it. So if they have a cyber insurance document which says you're covered up for this amount for a ransom payment, then you're going to be in quite a difficult position. You will also be if you've got quite a good revenue stream. So a lot of the time it's what is the leverage that they have? What is the value of the data? Is it quite old historical data? Is this data already in the public domain? So really we're not too worried about that sort of difficulty. Ultimately, there's always going to be some PII element, but we can handle that because of other aspects that we typically engage with. So one of the most important things really at the start of this is to understand what is the strategy here, what are we trying to achieve? Do we need a decryptor? Are we looking for just data suppression? Are we just trying to obtain actionable intelligence? Depending on, obviously those things could evolve across an incident as the incident evolves. But really, you need to make sure that you've got that strategy nailed down and make sure it's aligned to what the objectives of the victim organisation is. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the time these engagements are run in parallel with a breach coach and a law firm. So it's not just a case that we take over negotiations and we start speaking to threat actors. A lot of the time it's done in collaboration with the organisation and law firms, because obviously transcripts could potentially be leaked. It has happened, it's quite rare, but it does happen, so we need to make sure that organisation is comfortable. A second but really important aspect is OPSEC. So there's often times where sometimes we've been brought in to just do the cyber extortion negotiation element, and maybe we've not already achieved containment on the technical aspects of the actual incident itself. So one of the first things we ask is, are you sure this, the method in which you're handling the incident and communicating with both the law firm but also the client is secure and hasn't been compromised by a threat actor? Are we looking at communicating via an out-of-bounds channel? Are we leveraging 365, which a threat actor might have got into? Are we sure that this is secure? Unfortunately, there has been some matters in the past where we've been brought in where we were told that containment was achieved, but we quickly established early on that it wasn't. So it's something you do need to make sure that you are proactive in and understanding exactly how you're going to handle this, how you would run this type of engagement if you were to be a victim of that sort of event. So some of the kind of key takeaways that I want to jump into before we can happily take some questions if there are any, is synergy across the work streams. So often you've got your IT recovery work stream, you've got your forensic work stream, PR. Overarching that is the executives and the CISO that's looking at this. But really you can leverage for that to negotiations as a separate work stream as well. As I've mentioned, you can get a lot of good information out of that, even if you're not considering to pay a ransom. Second is making sure you are making informed decisions, and that's really using threat intel or what we know about the specific adversary that's targeted you for this incident. So a lot of the times in matters we're brought into, we've actually dealt with the same threat actors or affiliates, and we can tell based on the TTPs that we've identified. So we've got a pretty good understanding of what their thresholds might be from a pressurizing tactic, but also how much potential discount we could get, what deliverables we might be able to obtain from them as well. So obtaining as much threat intel on those specific adversaries is really important to enable the business to make their own informed decision. And also being proactive in preparing for these types of exercises. So we have seen an uptick recently in clients actually wanting to focus a bit more around extortion. It's a major risk. A lot of organizations try and write it off with cyber insurance policies, etc. But it's really important we do go and practice this. We have incidents coming in on a daily basis where organizations have never experienced this before, and we're having to walk through and take them through all of those specific risk factors. How would you engage with the media? How would you engage with law enforcement, etc.? What if there's an operation that's ongoing right now which has a disruption tactic like we saw with Lockbit? In the Lockbit matter, for example, we were actually engaged in multiple negotiations and forensic investigations at the time of the takedown, which made things quite interesting and did affect some of the engagements as well. So it's quite important. And we're going to see more and more of these disruption operations as well, and I think that is also the way to go. But these are some of the considerations that you do need to make if engaging potentially threat actor communications. And with that, I think there's 3 minutes left, so happy to take some questions if there are any.